I'm curious too, as you went around, you spoke to different, I guess, facets of law enforcement, the law enforcement professionals, but also members of the community, folks who have been the subjects of police violence, and I guess elected officials and whatnot. I mean, from your perspective, where are the big differences in attitudes and perspectives on what you do? I mean, as you sort of like, where are those perspectives that might be most surprising?
I think one of the things is that I don't think the public understands how, like when police departments recruit and they bring in officers and they hire officers and they go through this rigorous process, many times the officers have had no access or exposure to communities of color or communities who don't look like them. So that's a hurdle that you have to overcome. But you can overcome that by understanding, what your own internal biases are, your own experiences. Communities assume that people are prepared to deal with them. And then from the other side of the perspective, communities don't understand that, in all my years of work, and I never worked with anyone, and I've worked with some racist people, but I've never worked with anyone who came to work with the idea, I'm going to go out there and I'm going to kill someone today. And, I've never been around anyone that I felt that was the case with. The other thing communities keep asking us repeatedly, and I got asked this question throughout the process, why can't officers shoot people in the leg? Why can't they shoot to injure? And the standard answer for us is always the same. We shoot to diminish the threat, and the way we do that is by shooting center mass. And that's the way we train, and that's the way we perform under stress. So as I've told people in the past, if we shoot you in the leg, it's probably going to be a mistake, because that's not what we're trained to do at the end of the day. So there needs to be some understanding on the community's part. There needs to be more understanding and compassion on law enforcement's part.
I mean, is that type of training, does that make sense?
Oh, it absolutely makes sense. I mean, to someone who's been out there and involved, you kind of know when you're under fire and there's a threat, you need to stop that threat as soon as you can. And the only way you do that is to hit your target in vital body areas and the largest area of the body.
But what if you're not under fire? I mean, right? I mean, that's the issue, right? That's more of the issue, right? Like, I mean, we're not talking. You're not going through stories of a police officer under fire. You're going through stories of a police officer who thinks that they may be under fire in the future.
Well, not only that, but you get back to what we talk about in the book, is that boogeyman syndrome, thinking that everyone is against you. Look at what happened in the Betty Crutcher shooting. You have 5 officers on the scene with Betty Shelby shooting. You have 5 officers on the scene in Oklahoma. One officer fires, the others don't. One officer felt in fear of her life, the other officers didn't. And, she was removed and she was disciplined, but then she was brought back. So this idea that when I'm in fear of my life, I can use, and I'm justified in using force, that's what we are trained, and that's what we use, and that's what we say when things happen.
Well, I know. I mean, and I'm not. I mean, like, is that a problem with the training? I mean, you're trained to shoot for the largest body mass when you're under fire, but the definition of under fire, you're trained to perceive it as certainly, or you're allowed to experience it as a very loose experience. I mean,
what you're describing, obviously, many of those cases, the officers aren't under fire. In the Walter Scott case, the officer couldn't have been under fire. In the Betty Shelby case, she couldn't have been under fire. In some of the other cases, in East Pittsburgh and the one in Baltimore, they weren't under fire. So it's clearly examples of excessive force. We aren't taught how to use. We aren't taught to shoot people in the back. We're taught not to shoot people in the back. So some of these things that you see happen not only are a violation of policy, they're against the law.
But I mean, is that a function? Are those things happening because there isn't proper training?
Well, I think it's a combination of improper refresher training, but it's a problem with the individual officers and the way they're conducting their jobs.
And so, okay, so how do we address that? I mean, if the training is not necessarily problematic, and there's just a couple of there's a certain. I mean, the way you're talking about it's almost like there's a certain inevitability.
Right. Well, I think it has to be addressed. There has to be processes in place, and there are in many cases disciplinary processes and like. But what happens is in our culture, this is a cultural issue, and I'm going to say something to you to help you put this perspective. Sometimes culture eats strategy for lunch. So we try to implement these strategies and policies. And let me give you, for instance, in the Starbucks case in Philadelphia, the first thing the police chief did, the commissioner of police did, without having all the information, was he came out and he backed the troops. Well, good leaders back their troops. We know that. But good leaders also get all the good information before they go out on national television and give an answer. In this case, he had to come back and retract that statement when he had more information, and then he retracted it, and he said, hey, these officers weren't acting within the scope of what we're supposed to do. However, Starbucks was the reason because they called us there. So it's it becomes at a certain level a policy issue, but then at other levels it becomes conduct, accountability, and behavior.
In the book, you talk, I think it was to a retired New York police officer who basically said, like, what we did back in the day, maybe it was even the 80s, I think, we would get thrown in jail for today, right?
Right.
Right. I mean, what changes? I mean, so in other words, like that cop, I mean, presumably, right? Cops are not doing those same things. They're doing some things, but they're not doing what that cop was doing in the 80s. What is the difference? It's not just internally everybody got along, together in the I guess in the station house and said, look, guys, this stuff, we got to leave it in the 80s. It's the 90s now, or it's the aughts. We can't do that anymore, right? Like, was there outside change that behavior / culture?
Well, I think there was outside and internal. I think there were external forces like citizen review boards and things like that in different departments that brought in advanced oversight and, other eyes on incidents. There was a change and shift in culture in organizations that sort of to make a shift and say, hey, certain things were unacceptable. But we thought it was very important in this book to make sure we got the appropriate voices to tell the truth. Because what happens is there's a certain segment of society that doesn't believe that these sort of things happen. And then all of us that work within the field understand. And let me give you an example. In this case, the officer says very clearly, and keep in mind, most police officers don't develop their own crime-fighting strategies. The strategies are developed by police leaders, by politicians, by mayors, by citizen review boards, and the like. So in this case, what this story illustrates in the book is that he was told by a superior who was told by a member of the city council that they were going to do a walkthrough at a certain time of the day. Therefore, they were told to make sure that that corner was clear of everyone, any crimes, any drug dealing, etc. Because they were told to make sure that that corner was clear, the tacit green light was given that by all means, make sure no one is on that corner. So the first question is, why aren't we doing that, and why aren't we doing something effective every day, not just for the city council? And secondly, is it okay to empty the corner at all costs? In this case, apparently it was. So the officer was very candid with us in telling us how they proceeded to do that. And that's an example of bad policing. Most people would agree with you that I know that would be unacceptable in today's environment and for good reason.
Well, what's your perspective on Black Lives Matter? I mean, insofar as the awareness that it is created in terms of the way Black people are policed.
Right. Well, I think that they have and had their place and continue to have their place in raising the awareness. I mean, they essentially did what civil rights leaders did in the 1960s, and they raised the awareness by using cell phones and technology and social media to ensure that the entire world knew what was happening here in the United States in different places. They exploited the idea of what I call coptics, the optics of policing in the digital age. They exploited this idea that what happens in Miami can now happen in New York in a nanosecond via viral videos and social media. So they did that. I think where things went awry was when police decided that, we were under attack. Well, we're under attack because everybody's videoing what they're seeing, and it's not all of us, it's some of us, thus creating this whole movement with Blue Lives Matter and, those sorts of things. Now, in the book, we talk a lot about, if you really read and if you really absorb and you really pay attention to history and data, right, everything that we see and experience in society will tell you that Black lives don't matter. So I think to have the discussion about Black Lives Matter and Blue Lives Matter and White Lives Matter, listen, at the end of the day, all lives should matter, but all lives haven't matter, and that was part of the reason why we decided to write the book and explore this issue.
What is your sense about how, I mean, there was, I don't know if you're familiar, Chris Hayes wrote a book about the colony, colony and a nation. And his thesis was that we have two large modes of policing in this country. One is the sort of the protect and serve, and that one is reserved, not exclusively for white people, but certainly for white people and people living, in not living in poverty, let's say. Whereas people living in poverty and largely we talk about minority folk living primarily in urban centers, there's a different form of policing, which is more about control.
Right.
Give me your sense of your perspective on something like that.
Well, I mean, I think it's clear that, the social issues are very different in different social economic environments. That's very clear. But also knowing and having done policing, I understand from the ground level that the expectation is different in different communities. And people have a very real right to be upset that when you ask white people in America, what do you think about your police and what's your opinion? And people say, our police are great. They protect and serve. They come when we call them. They're courteous. They're polite to our children. They speak to them in playgrounds. And then when you talk to people in some urban areas and you say, what's your experience? And you say, we don't understand why police call us names or swear at us or yell at us. Even good people, right? So there is a difference in perspective on how policing is being done in different areas. And, in the book, we talked to a Chicago commander. And she says, when she used to go out as a supervisor, the citizens will come up to her and say, we don't understand why your officers call us this or call us that. So I think in working all these years in the profession, we know, and I know, and if people are candid, they will tell you that certain behaviors are not tolerated in certain communities. So then it goes back to, as a community, sort of demanding and asking for the way you want to be policed. So we talk about that in the book as well.
One of the things that I've heard is that part of the reason why the police continue, and there's behavior that is, poor policing, but then it's, like you say, it's in many respects there's a culture where you will protect your fellow police officers, even in those instances. To what extent do local DAs have a role in impacting the culture in a given police force?
Sure. Well, I think that they go for 1 second working with people, just like I have, day in and day out, long hours, interviews, investigating crime, investigating victims of crime and perpetrators of crime. So one day and 7 days they're doing that, and then you turn around and they're forced to have to investigate someone who they worked with or someone who knows who they worked with. So it's a very difficult thing to do. But at the end of the day, what most people that I know will tell you is that once the penalties for protecting people who do wrong become greater than the allegiances to the people who do wrong, that once they become greater, then you'll start to see things change. And even from the DA perspective, when they have to arrest a cop because of something they've done, whether it's use of force or lying on a report or something like that, it sends a rippling message throughout the organization. And it's generally not a good message, but it sends a message nonetheless that perhaps if you're considering these behaviors, this might happen to you as well. So I think the DAs and the attorneys and the U.S. attorneys, they play a role, and they should play. And where appropriate, they should play a very strong role.
Do we need more community independent community review boards because of that dilemma that you have? DAs have the ability, prosecutors have the ability to provide accountability, but there's a lot of disincentive to do so. I mean, similar to you with your colleagues or a cop with their colleagues. I mean, do we need more of those community review boards?
Well, I think community review boards are great if the right people with the right credentials are on them. But also, in some cases where things are extremely sensitive, you need sort of like an independent prosecutor, just like you would for any major federal investigation where there's a conflict of interest. If there's a conflict of interest, you bring in another person to handle it that doesn't possess the same conflict. And it's really a simple solution, but it has to be one that people are willing to embark upon.